I heard the sound of an approaching car as I poured my morning coffee in the quiet of my usual routine. The early sun bathed the kitchen in soft light as the car door slammed shut. James glanced at me briefly as if apologizing for the noise, then hurried toward the door. I peeked out the window and saw him embracing a tall young man, barely able to contain his excitement. Kevin. He was visiting us for the first time in several years. I knew he had grown up, but I hadn't expected this transformation. His confident posture and resolute gaze contrasted sharply with the boy I remembered. They entered the house, and I overheard James explaining how much he was relying on Kevin's help. His voice sounded animated, and for the first time in a long while, I noticed how my husband could still feel genuine joy. It was rare to see him so inspired, especially in recent years. Work had become his purpose, and our conversations about it had replaced any intimacy between us. When I walked into the living room, their laughter filled the space. Kevin stood, smiling faintly at me, and his gaze lingered for a moment. Something about that look pulled me away from my thoughts of everyday chores. After breakfast, the men threw themselves into work. From the kitchen window, I watched them standing over blueprints, deeply engrossed in discussion. James had always been a professional, but his enthusiasm faded when he worked alone. Kevin seemed to have rekindled a spark in him. As I stepped into the garden to collect laundry, their voices carried over. I wasn't eavesdropping, but one of Kevin's questions made me smile. His tone left no doubt. He wasn't just helping, he was genuinely interested in the project. By evening, the house was lively again. James proudly recounted how quickly Kevin grasped everything. Their bond was growing stronger, and at some point I realized that my husband was laughing sincerely for the first time in ages. Dinner was simple, yet filled with Kevin's stories about his recent travels. His tales of mountains and cities piqued even James's interest, a man who usually dismissed anything unrelated to work. I only half listened, stealing glances at their interaction. After dinner, I retreated upstairs first. Lying in bed, I tried to make sense of my feelings. James's happiness for Kevin was clear, but it underscored something I lacked. We were finding less and less time for each other. His once gentle, frequent touches had become almost non-existent. I missed the days when our evenings ended with long conversations or walks. I could still hear their voices downstairs. The light laughter of Kevin and James, planning tomorrow's work, felt both warm and alienating. My place in their conversation had long since lost its relevance. I closed my eyes, trying to soothe the strange emptiness within me. When James finally came upstairs, I pretended to be asleep. He passed by without noticing anything that could betray my thoughts. The house seemed to come alive with Kevin's arrival. The noise, voices, endless conversations, and laughter filled a space that had been drowned in silence. James spent all his time with him, as if trying to make up for the years they had missed. Kevin proved to be not just a capable assistant, but also someone who inspired James with new ideas. I tried not to interfere, immersing myself in my own tasks, but Kevin's presence was palpable even when he wasn't nearby. Whenever I passed the garage or entered the room where they worked, I felt his gaze on me. Those glances weren't brazen, more like curious, as if he was trying to understand something hidden from him. Each day, I became more aware of how he transformed the space around him. His confidence, fluid movements, and almost imperceptible gestures created a strange tension. Even the simplest actions, how he lifted a cup or accidentally brushed against the table, caught my attention in ways I hadn't expected. When Kevin helped with household chores, it seemed natural, but there was something beneath the surface of that naturalness. Once he brought me a cup of tea, and his hand, extended toward me, was so close that I felt my breath catch slightly. I tried not to reveal my reaction, but the faint excitement lingered all day. That evening, after dinner, when James left for a meeting, the silence in the house became oppressive. I was clearing the table, aware of Kevin moving around the room, gathering the last of the dishes. His presence was too tangible, and I found myself tuned into his every step. He sat at the table for a while, watching me in silence. That silence was heavier than any conversation could have been. I avoided looking at him, focusing on my tasks, but I could feel his gaze following my every move. Later, he began talking about his future plans. His words flowed calmly, but between the lines I sensed something more, a subtle attempt to share a piece of his inner self. He spoke about wanting to be useful to his uncle, how important it was for him to prove he could handle the responsibility. His voice was warm yet confident, which made me listen more attentively than I expected. There was such sincerity in what he said that I felt a kind of respect for his determination. When James returned, I felt a strange sense of relief. But that night marked a new turning point for me. I realized that an invisible boundary had already formed between Kevin and me, and I didn't know if I would cross it, or if I even had the strength to hold myself back. The evening began like any other. James, as always, talked about the project that now consumed all his thoughts. Kevin listened attentively, occasionally adding his own ideas. I barely participated in the conversation, focusing instead on setting the table. Their voices blended into the background, but I could feel the tension within me growing. As dinner progressed, I got up to clear the table and start preparing dessert. At one point, I heard James suggest Kevin share his experiences from his previous job. Their voices drifted into the living room, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I barely had a moment of relief when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Kevin. He stood in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, his expression calm but with something more in his eyes. "Thought I'd help," he said simply, stepping closer. I nodded without a word, focusing on slicing fruit. Yet his presence seemed to fill every corner of the room. Kevin picked up a knife and started slicing an apple beside me. His movements were unhurried, but precise. At one point, our hands brushed against each other. I pulled mine back as if burned, but he didn't move his. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt as though even the air had thickened. I took a step to the side, trying to maintain composure, but everything inside me was in turmoil. The next moment, Kevin turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine. It was a fleeting instant, yet it felt eternal. Before I could process what was happening, he leaned in and kissed me. The kiss was soft but insistent. My body froze, my mind screaming that this was wrong, yet I couldn't push him away immediately. Only after a few seconds did I abruptly pull back, feeling a hot wave rush to my face. "Kevin," I managed to say, "this isn't right." He didn't respond, just looked at me with a gaze filled with more questions than I could handle. I quickly left the kitchen, leaving him alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept circling back to what had happened. It was wrong, but why then did I feel something akin to excitement? Why hadn't I stopped him right away? I tried to justify my feelings. Perhaps it was just a moment of weakness, a fleeting mistake. I had no intention of continuing down this path, yet thoughts of Kevin kept returning over and over. The next morning, I tried to act as though everything was normal, but his presence became almost unbearable. Every time our eyes met, I felt myself replaying that moment in the kitchen. I told myself it was just an isolated incident, something that would never happen again. But my confidence in that notion was waning with each passing day. Days went by and the tension between Kevin and me only grew stronger. I tried to avoid moments where we might be alone, but it turned out to be harder than I had anticipated. James had fully immersed himself in his work, delegating many tasks to Kevin. They spent more and more time in the garage, leaving me alone in the house with my thoughts. I kept telling myself that what had happened in the kitchen was a mistake, a moment of weakness. But every time I saw Kevin, that moment came rushing back. His gaze seemed to say more than words, and his presence made my heart race. One evening, James stayed late at a meeting. I finished preparing dinner when Kevin walked into the kitchen, as if sensing that we'd be alone again. "You're always doing everything by yourself," he said, stepping closer. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. But he didn't leave, and I could feel the tension between us growing again. "Don't you think you're overworking yourself?" His voice was soft, but there was something more behind it than simple concern. "I'm fine," I replied, turning toward the stove. I knew I should leave, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. When I felt his hand brush against mine, I froze. It was a barely noticeable touch, but it caused a storm inside me. "Daniela," he whispered. His voice was low, almost pleading. I turned to him and our eyes met. I wanted to say something to stop him, but instead I took a step closer. Kevin leaned in and our lips met again. This kiss was different. not tentative or hesitant like the first, but deep, full of passion. My heart pounded, but at that moment I couldn't think about what was right or wrong. When I pulled away, my breath was heavy. I felt a flush rise to my cheeks, and without waiting for him to speak, I left the room. In the darkness of the bedroom, I sat for a long time, trying to calm the chaos in my mind, guilt mixed with an inexplicable desire. Why couldn't I maintain my distance? Why did his touch awaken something in me I thought was long forgotten? James came back late, tired but pleased. He spoke about the project's progress and how much Kevin had accomplished that day. I tried to listen, but thoughts of Kevin wouldn't let me go. The following days became a true test for me. I saw how Kevin and James grew closer, working on the project. Their conversations became more personal, and in James I saw a joy I hadn't noticed in a long time. But this only intensified my internal struggle. On one hand, I wanted to be honest with myself and preserve what James and I had. On the other hand, I was drawn to Kevin with a force I couldn't resist. Each evening, left alone with my thoughts, I tried to figure out what to do. But with each passing day, I realized there was no simple answer. With each passing day, I felt the growing emptiness between James and me. His attention was entirely consumed by the project, and even at dinner, he spoke only about what still needed to be done. His words felt distant, as if he was speaking not to me, but to himself. I tried to find reasons to start conversations, but all my attempts ended in brief responses or perfunctory comments. James didn't notice me pulling away. He simply didn't look in my direction long enough to notice anything at all. During this time, Kevin remained close. He didn't push or impose himself, but his presence became increasingly significant. His gaze, his ability to appear at just the right moment, his light yet precise remarks, all of it started to fill the void I felt in my relationship with James. He always found ways to support me, even in the smallest of things. One evening, when James was working late again, I sat in the living room with a cup of coffee, trying to distract myself from the weight of my thoughts. Kevin approached, sat across from me, and silently handed me a blanket. The gesture was so simple, yet it carried a warmth and care I hadn't felt in a long time. Our conversations grew more personal. He shared his dreams with me, how he wanted to build a career that wasn't just a job, but something meaningful. I listened and occasionally opened up about thoughts I hadn't even shared with James in years. It was in those moments that I realized how much I missed this kind of connection. Kevin became a source of comfort, an outlet for emotions I had long since lost in the monotony of daily life. At the same time, I became more aware of how unsustainable this was. One look at James, immersed in his blueprints, reminded me that I was still a wife. Every time I looked at Kevin, I felt a mix of guilt and an irresistible pull. I decided I needed to put an end to it, to stop the conversations, avoid being alone with him. I tried to maintain my distance, but my efforts felt unconvincing even to myself. Kevin seemed to notice my hesitation, but said nothing. His gaze spoke volumes more than words ever could. He didn't reproach me, but his silence made everything harder. One night, I lay awake in bed, listening to James's steady breathing beside me. It was in that moment I realized I was in a situation with no easy way out. My life had split into two parts, one with James, stable but joyless, and the other with Kevin, full of emotion but destructive. I knew I had to make a choice, but each day I postponed the decision, afraid of losing everything all at once. The house fell silent as soon as James left to meet his friends. The quiet was tense, enveloping, like the anticipation of something inevitable. I tried to busy myself with mundane tasks, but the awareness of Kevin's presence lingered. He was somewhere nearby, and I knew that sooner or later we would be alone. When I walked into the living room, he was sitting on the couch, casually flipping through a magazine. His posture seemed relaxed, but I sensed a hidden tension. His gaze flicked toward me, lingering a moment longer than necessary. "Fresh air would be nice right now," he remarked, his tone calm, though the words felt more like an invitation. I hesitated, but something inside urged me toward the door. Outside, the air was cool, a light breeze playing with strands of my hair, but I barely noticed it. We walked in silence, each step echoing in my mind like a pulse. When we reached the park, the silence became almost unbearable. The moonlight bathed the paths, reflecting off the leaves and making the night feel almost transparent. I sensed him stop beside me and turned to look at him. His expression was serious, searching. He didn't say a word, but his gaze conveyed more than words ever could. In that moment, it felt as though the entire world had disappeared, leaving only us with our unspoken emotions. My attempt to step back faltered. His hand brushed mine, emotion so light it was almost imperceptible, yet it stirred a storm within me. Every feeling I had been suppressing erupted to the surface. I felt my breath quicken. My mind insisted I should leave, but my body refused to obey. When his face moved closer, I couldn't find the strength to turn away. A moment later, his lips met mine. That kiss was charged with everything we couldn't put into words. It was a desire I feared but couldn't ignore. His arms wrapped around me, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to forget everything. But the moment didn't last long. I abruptly pulled away, feeling reality crash down on me with overwhelming force. My breathing was ragged, my thoughts chaotic. "This is a mistake," I whispered, my voice trembling. Kevin remained silent. His gaze was filled with pain and something else I couldn't decipher. I turned away, taking a step back, then another. The walk back home was filled with oppressive silence. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts swirled around what had happened. I tried to justify myself, but the excuses felt hollow. My attraction to Kevin had grown too strong to ignore. I understood that my feelings for James were no longer what they once were. Our relationship had become a habit, comfortable but devoid of passion. Kevin reminded me that I was still capable of feeling, but the price of that reminder was far too high. Guilt and desire intertwined in my soul, leaving me restless. I knew one thing. This connection with Kevin couldn't continue, yet letting go of it completely seemed impossible. A few days had passed since that night, yet I still felt its echoes in every movement I made. Guilt, tangled with desire, wouldn't leave me in peace. I tried to focus on the house, on daily tasks, but every action was accompanied by thoughts of Kevin. My mind and body seemed torn between duty and the emotions that had surged with renewed intensity. It felt as if every glance from Kevin, every accidental touch, pulled me back to what I was desperately trying to forget. James remained absorbed in his work. His days were meticulously planned, and our conversations revolved around project details. He seemed oblivious to my absence. This realization, instead of bringing relief, only deepened my sense of emptiness. Each morning I woke with the feeling of being on the edge. Kevin avoided direct interactions with me, yet his presence lingered in every room I entered. I caught his silent, questioning looks, but neither of us spoke. I knew I had to do something. Tell James, confess at least to my doubts. But the fear of losing everything I had spent so long building kept me silent. Even now, when our relationship was far from perfect, it was still a part of my life, a part of me. One evening, sitting at dinner, I realized I was barely listening to James. His voice was just background noise to my thoughts, which carried me back to memories of how Kevin had looked at me that night. It struck me that I could no longer maintain this double life, even within myself. But speaking about it out loud felt unthinkable. I saw in James a man who still trusted me, who made plans and envisioned a future where I played the role of a faithful wife. Meanwhile, Kevin wouldn't let me forget what had happened. His presence reminded me that I wasn't living my own life, that there was something more within me than the role I had grown used to playing. I spent sleepless nights, mentally sorting through my options. Confess to James? It would destroy everything. Walk away from Kevin? But could I truly return to the routine I had known before? The internal conflict tore me apart. The life that had once seemed stable now felt like it was unraveling at the seams. Kevin seemed to sense it. He avoided conversations that could lead to personal topics. But his silence was more eloquent than words. He was waiting, but for what? I couldn't tell. That night, lying in bed beside James, I realized I could no longer live torn between these two worlds. But taking a step forward seemed as impossible as retreating. The day was filled with routine. James had been working in the garden since morning, tending to bushes and flower beds. His presence outside the window created an illusion of stability, but inside, chaos raged within me. The glances Kevin and I exchanged, his subtle hints, all of it kept me on edge. As I cleaned the kitchen after lunch, Kevin's footsteps sounded behind me. I felt his presence before he even came close. His hands suddenly rested on my shoulders, and I froze, not daring to turn around. "Kevin, not now," I whispered, but my voice was too weak to sound convincing. "Just look how perfectly it's all arranged," he said, leaning in slightly. His breath brushed against my neck. "Your husband is outside, so busy with the garden he won't even notice." My first reaction was indignation. It felt far too risky, yet unbearably tempting. I turned to stop him, but he had already wrapped his arms around me, pulling me closer. His touch, firm and insistent, burned against my skin. "This is madness," I exhaled, feeling my resistance begin to crumble. "That's what makes it so sweet," he murmured, his voice thick with desire. I could hear James working with his tools somewhere outside the window. Every movement from outside pushed me closer to the edge, where desire outweighed fear. Kevin turned me to face him, his gaze deep and bold. Without leaving room for hesitation, he kissed me, and this time I didn't try to pull away. His hands slid down, lifting me onto the countertop. Everything happened quickly, almost urgently. I felt the world around us disappear, leaving only this moment. Every touch, every movement was charged with a force that left no room for rational thought. It ended as abruptly as it had begun. Heavy breaths, the lingering warmth of his hands on my skin, all of it a reminder of what we had just done. "We can't keep doing this," I said, still trying to catch my breath. He smirked, stepping back. "That's up to you?" I knew he was right. It truly was up to me, but that fact only made everything harder. James never noticed what had happened inside the house. When he came in with a bucket of weeds and stood at the sink to wash his hands, I stood at the stove trying to appear calm. But inside, I felt as though something was tearing me apart. This connection with Kevin had become a trap. Every time I tried to stop, he found a way to pull me back in. My life, my family, my emotions, they had all turned into a tangled web of contradictions. I no longer knew what I truly wanted. The final week of Kevin's stay was coming to an end. The project was complete, and the house was gradually returning to its usual quiet. James was pleased with the outcome. His nephew had done an excellent job, and everything seemed as though life was returning to normal. But I knew that wasn't true. Kevin was packing his things in his room, and every sound of his footsteps echoed inside me. I stood by the door, feeling the inevitability of his departure draw closer with each passing moment. My heart raced, not in anticipation of peace, but in fear of the void his absence would leave behind. "You won't lose me," he said when we found ourselves alone in the garden. His voice was soft yet resolute. I couldn't respond. Words failed me. All I could do was nod, trying to suppress the turmoil rising within me. When the car took him away, disappearing over the horizon, I felt the emptiness seep into the house. James immersed himself back into his blueprints, his voice carrying on as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. The days without Kevin were excruciating. Every hour stretched endlessly, and even the most mundane things reminded me of him. His touch, his voice, his confidence, all of it lingered as if he had never left. We agreed to meet a few days later. The location was chosen carefully to ensure no one would find out. A quiet hotel on the outskirts of town. When I entered the room, he was already waiting. A wave of emotions washed over me. Our eyes met, and everything I had been trying to suppress came bursting forth. He stepped closer, and I felt the warmth of his hands. In that moment, I no longer thought about what would come next. The passion we had been holding back finally found its release. His kisses were insistent, his touch burning. This wasn't just an act of desire. It was the culmination of everything that had been building between us all this time. When it was over, a wave of guilt swept over me again. I knew I had crossed a line from which there was no return. But looking at him, I understood that in this moment, he had become the embodiment of everything I had been hiding within myself. As I made my way home, I realized that this day would stay with me forever. That meeting had been the final chapter in our game, but it left an indelible mark on my soul. Life was settling back into its usual rhythm. James was once again fully immersed in his work, his schedule even more demanding than before. He was rarely home, and when he was, his exhaustion erased any chance for meaningful conversation. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my thoughts constantly returned to Kevin. Our last goodbye had left a mark I couldn't forget. His words, his gaze, his touch. They had become part of my inner world, something I couldn't let go of. A month passed. During that time, I lived on autopilot, going through the motions of daily life. But one evening, a late notification on my phone broke the monotony. It was a message from Kevin. "I'm in town. James is away, right? Can we meet?" Those words shook me. I knew I should have ignored him, but I couldn't. My heart raced, and a feeling I could no longer suppress flared in my chest. The next day, I found an excuse to leave the house. James was away on a business trip, and I told myself I just needed a distraction. But deep down, I knew exactly where I was going. Kevin was waiting for me at a small hotel outside the city. When I stepped into the room, his eyes met mine. No words were needed. Everything we had been holding back over the past weeks burst forth as he moved closer and wrapped his arms around me. His touch was insistent, yet filled with warmth. In that moment, there was no room for doubt. Our bodies came together, and I felt the boundaries of reality blur. This wasn't just desire. It was a profound emotional connection I hadn't felt in so long. Every moment with him made me feel alive in a way I had lost in the monotony of daily life. But with it came guilt. I knew I was betraying my husband, but I couldn't stop. In that moment, I was living in two worlds, one with James, calm and predictable, the other with Kevin, vivid and filled with passion. When it was over, we lay side by side in silence. His fingers traced patterns on my arm, and I tried to etch every second of this moment into my memory. "When next?" he asked. I sighed, searching for the right words, but instead I simply nodded. We agreed to meet again. His gaze told me he wasn't ready to end this any more than I was. When I returned home, the house felt even emptier than before. James wasn't there, but I knew even his presence wouldn't fill this void. Kevin had become more than just a lover to me. He had become a part of me. A part I could no longer let go of, no matter how hard I tried. Everything that had happened in recent weeks had become my new reality, one I could no longer deny. After each meeting with Kevin, I returned home with conflicting emotions. My heart warmed by his touch, followed inevitably by the cold grip of guilt. James, as always, noticed nothing. His world was structured, orderly, and filled with work. I caught myself realizing that his inattentiveness had become not just familiar but convenient. Each day, meticulously planned, gave me the freedom to live a life where I was no longer the woman he thought he knew. Kevin told me he would be leaving for a few months. His voice was calm, but I could hear the regret in it. He promised to write as soon as he could return. His words felt like a promise I couldn't refuse, even if I wanted to. "We'll continue," he said the last time we met before his departure. "This isn't the end." When he left, I felt the house fill with emptiness again. James was home, but his presence brought no comfort. His words about work were background noise as I sat at the table, mentally reliving my moments with Kevin. My life was now split into two parts, each with its own truth. In one, I was a wife, predictable, composed, the person James saw me as. In the other, I was a woman living for passion, allowing myself to break every rule. With each new thought of Kevin, I realized that returning to my old life was impossible. I could no longer be the wife I once was. To James, I was part of his structured existence. But inside, I had already stepped far beyond its bounds. Each morning, I woke with a heaviness in my chest. My days were filled with routine tasks, but every little thing reminded me of him. Things I hadn't noticed before, music, words from a random conversation, now conjured his image. I knew the game we were playing couldn't go on forever. One day, James would notice something, ask questions I couldn't avoid answering. But in the moments I thought of that, the fear of the future was overshadowed by the burning desire to hold on to what Kevin and I had. Kevin was far away, but in my mind he was closer than James, sitting right across from me. His presence had become a part of my inner world, and I didn't know if I could ever let it go. The evening was quiet. James, as usual, was holed up in his study, working through yet another report. I sat on the couch in the living room, flipping through a book I had picked up for distraction, but the words blurred before my eyes. My thoughts kept returning to the fact that I was now dividing my life between two completely opposite worlds. James gave me everything I needed for a secure future. With him, I felt stability, reliability, and safety. He was always precise, attentive to detail. And even when the romance in our marriage faded, his presence brought me peace. But with Kevin, I found something entirely different. Where James was orderly, Kevin was chaotic. He reminded me of a part of myself I had long forgotten, untamed, alive, capable of feeling every moment intensely. I caught myself comparing them. James never asked unnecessary questions when I said I needed an evening alone. He respected my boundaries, giving me time and space. But that respect sometimes made our relationship feel cold, as if it were more of an agreement than a love story. With Kevin, everything was different. His hands spoke more than words. His gaze made me forget the rest of the world. In his presence, I felt wanted, needed. Every memory of our encounters filled me with conflicting emotions. On one hand, I knew how wrong it was, how deeply I was betraying the man who cared for me. On the other hand, I couldn't bring myself to sever this connection. When I looked at James, I saw a man who had built a solid foundation for us. He had provided me with everything I needed for a comfortable life. I never worried about money, the house, or what tomorrow would bring. But somewhere within that comfort, I had lost myself. Kevin had become a reminder of who I once was, before everything became so predictable. He couldn't offer me reliability, but he gave me what I had been missing for so long: passion, desire, the feeling of being alive. I knew I was living in two parallel worlds, and both had me trapped. In one, I was someone respected and valued. In the other, I was someone desired and dreamed of. But the longer I lived in this duality, the more I realized it couldn't last forever.